Hello everyone.
Hello everyone.
Welcome to our book club. I am Miss Maka.
And I am Mr. Darrell. Today we are going to talk about a British classic novel, Middlemarch.
A story by George Eliot. But before we go to the story, let's look at our agenda. So first of all, we will start with the vocabulary that we have chosen from the book or from our speech for today. Then we're going to talk about the author. After, we will talk about the summary of the book, so we will tell you shortly what is the story about.
And from there, we will look at the characters. This is the way that the story is told. We will have a look at the setting for the context of the story, and have a look at possibly the most important parts of the story, the main themes.
Yes, and finally, we will have a brief conclusion, and of course, we will give you a homework.
I'm looking forward to the feedback of people's answers to our question.
Definitely.
First, let's move on to the vocabulary. We've chosen 8 words that we want to focus on. They occur in the book and they occur in our discussion today. So, our first word is scholar. Scholar. This is someone who studies something in a deep way, but it doesn't have to be a scientific topic. It can be humanities, the arts, so an expert in humanities topics.
Metznieri, სწავლული.
Our next word is to flatter. Flatter. This is when you admire someone and praise them.
ქება.
Our next word is manufacturer. Manufacturer. This is a person or company that makes products in large numbers, usually in a factory.
მწარმოებელი.
Our next word is to embroider. To embroider. This is when you decorate cloth or other things with designs of colored types of things.
მოქარგვა.
Okay, our next phrase is why on earth? Why on earth? It's an expression used to add emphasis to questions and often used by native speakers. For example, why on earth would you do that? You can tell someone.
რატომ? რისთვის?
Our next word is disinherited. Disinherited. This is when you make legal agreements so that a close relative or a beneficiary will not receive your property or money after you pass on, after you die.
მემკვიდრეობა ჩამორთმეული.
Our next word is to resign. To resign. This is when you state formally that you are leaving a job permanently.
თანამდებობიდან გადადგომა.
And our last word is bribe. Bribe. This is usually money or a present given to someone so that they will help you to do something usually dishonest or illegal.
ქრთამი. Not really interesting to use this word, right? Okay. Now, after we listen to our vocabulary, let's have a question for our audience. So give us a situation when you would use the phrase, why on earth?
For example, imagine you order coffee and your friend puts salt in it instead of sugar. You respond with, why on earth would you do that?
Yeah, thank you. Nice example. Exactly. It is really interesting. Why would you ever put salt in the coffee, right?
I'd be angry.
Yeah, of course.
Okay, and we have another question for our audience. What are some phrases that teachers might use to flatter students?
Some typical phrases like good job, well done, nice job, perfect, and that's the way.
Great answer.
Well done.
I do say those often.
Yeah, exactly. Me too. So now let's move on to our author, Mary Ann Evans, who was born in 1819 and died in 1880. So she was known by her pen name George Eliot, and to be honest, I also knew her as George Eliot. So she was an English novelist, poet, journalist, translator, and one of the leading writers of the Victorian era.
She wrote 7 novels, all of them set in provincial England, and they are all known for the realism and the psychological insight.
Yes, although female writers were published under the female names during her lifetime, she wanted to escape the stereotype that women used to write light-hearted romances, and also she wanted to have her fiction judged separately from her already extensive and widely known work as a critic.
Very good. There was another reason, though, might have been equally as important. There was a bit of scandal in her life, and she might have wanted to hide her real life from the public. And the scandal was that she was living with a married man at the time, which was very scandalous, of course.
Of course, and I think she chose the right way to hide her privacy, right?
Use a pen name.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So Middlemarch has been described by the critics as the greatest novel in the English language.
Wow, so we are in for a treat today with our discussion.
Yes, and after hearing some stories about the author, of course we should ask a question to our audience, right? Mm-hmm. Do you think it's an advantage when an author comes from the same place she writes about?
Generally writing is about creativity and imagination, but we can also see clearly that when a writer from the place she writes about and gives more realistic effect, this story can also be more factual.
Ah, great answer.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you very much. So, of course, she would know the facts about her lifetime, right?
In a deeper way.
Of course. So, now let's look at the summary. What is the story about? Middlemarch focuses on the residents of Middlemarch Town, a fictitious town, from 1829. So, the main plots are the life of Dorothy Brooke and the famous doctor, Turtius Lidgate.
Mm-hmm. Now, Dorothy Brooke is a 19-year-old orphan living with her younger sister. Dorothea is courted by Sir James Chetham, a young man close to her own age, but she doesn't care for him. She's attracted instead to the much older Reverend Edward Casabone, and he's about 45 and she was about 20, so big difference in age.
Yes, but she still accepts the proposal and she still decides to marry Casabone, although her sister is very worried about this. Meanwhile, Chatham finds another girl, so he is really attracted to this girl, and actually she developed an interest in him.
Mm-hmm. Dorothea and Casabone experience the first tensions of their marriage very quickly. Mm-hmm. In fact, in the honeymoon, when Dorothea finds that the husband is not interested in involving her in his life's work. He's got intellectual, scholarly work, and he's not interested in having her help him, which is mysterious.
Yeah, soon she meets Will Ladislaw. So Will Ladislaw is the younger cousin of Casabone, and Casabone actually financially supports this person. Ladislaw begins to feel attracted to Dorothea, but she remains oblivious, but they two become friends soon.
Now, Dorothea is one of the main characters that we're focusing on, but we have another character that we want to focus on as well. So let's pick up his story now. Mm-hmm. Dr. Turtius Lidgate, the newly arrived doctor in Middlemarch. He's also a bit idealistic, just as Dorothea is. And he's got new ideas about medicine and sanitation. So he's a forward-thinking, progressive doctor. And he has this idea that doctors shouldn't sell medicines themselves. Mm-hmm. They should just diagnose the patient. He thinks that that's the proper thing to do. And of course, this takes criticism from the townsfolk. They think he's too crazy with these wild ideas. And they think it's a bad idea.
Yeah. Casabone arrives back from Rome only to have a heart attack. So Lydgate, he came there to look after him, but he soon told Dorothea that there are almost no chances that he would survive.
So what happens is Casabone dies, and his final legal papers, they kind of bring up suspicion in many people when they read them that there was something going on between Ladislaw and Dorothea. But that's a mistake because there wasn't at that time, at that point. So it kind of leads to awkwardness between Ladislaw and Dorothea.
Yes, Ladislaw is secretly in love with Dorothea, but he really keeps this to himself. So because he doesn't have any desire to involve Dorothea into some kind of scandal, and also he doesn't really want to disinherit her. So disinherit, she would lose all money that Casabone had left for her. So meanwhile, she realizes that she has some kind of warm feelings towards Ladislaw, but must suppress them.
Now, going back to our other character, Dr. Lydgate, he becomes stuck in a scandal, unfortunately, and only Dorothea still believes in him. But nonetheless, what happens is that Lydgate is forced to get kicked out of Middlemarch, the town.
Yeah, Ladislaw decides to leave, and of course he wouldn't go without saying goodbye to Dorothea. But Dorothea actually has fallen in love with Ladislaw, and he soon announces to her family that she's going to marry. So she even doesn't care about the fortune that Casabone has left for her. Ladislaw engages in public reform, and Dorothea, content with her life, she just looks after her husband and has 2 children with him.
You know what, Ms. Maka, I like that story. It interests me.
Yeah, of course, and it really shows the life of a strong woman.
An idealistic woman.
And
2 idealistic characters, Lydgate and Dorothea.
yeah.
Okay, we have a question for the audience. Now, it's a complex, large story. How would you summarize the story in a single sentence?
This is a story about the time when women used to marry to improve their social status, and it also teaches us to marry for love.
Oh, that's a great answer. It's a perfect summary of the story.
Yeah, exactly. She named both important things that actually the story is trying to tell us. Thank you very much.
Okay, let's move on to characters, the moving parts of the story, the parts that move to get us from the beginning to the end of the story. Now let's focus on Dorothy Brooke. So, as you might have guessed from our summary, she's an intelligent, wealthy woman with great aspirations. She avoids displaying her wealth. She's very idealistic, actually, a good, principled woman. And she's modern in this way, unlike maybe characters from Charlotte Bronte or Jane Austen.
Our next character is Turtius Leadgate. He is an idealistic, talented, but naive young doctor. He's rather poor, but of good birth, so from a very respected family. So he hopes to make changes, huge changes in medicine because he's doing some kind of research, but ends up in an unhappy marriage. So his attempts to show he is answerable to no man fail, and he eventually has to leave town, sacrificing his high ideals to please his wife.
Okay, very good. Let's move on to the other character now, Reverend Edward Casabone, from the beginning of the story, as you remember. He's a selfish, elderly clergyman, that means a man who works for the church, who's taken up with the scholarly research that he's doing. And his marriage to Dorothy is loveless. So there's a lot of things lacking in him. His book remains unfinished, and the research is also out of date. He's aware of this, and he doesn't admit it to anyone. So he's got all of the negative characteristics of you could have in a scholar.
Yes, and our next character is Will Ladislaw. So he is a young cousin of Casabone with no property. So his grandmother actually falls in love with a Polish person, musician, and was disinherited. So he is a man who is very idealistic and very talented, but with no fixed profession. So he doesn't do anything, we can see. And he is in love with Dorothea, but cannot really marry her without her losing Mr. Casabone's fortune.
Okay, and last of all, we have Rosamund Vincy. She is the woman who marries Lydgate and produces an unhappy marriage, unfortunately. So one of the few female characters that is contrasts with Dorothy and is not as idealistic.
Yeah, exactly. We can see that she kind of influenced her husband, and so of course she might be a strong character. Okay, now it's time for our question to our audience. After introducing to Dorothea, who do you think benefited more from the marriage?
As you see, Dorothea was an idealist and a wealthy woman, and she didn't need to improve to her social status. It is her husband who benefits from this union as he got helps on his work.
Wow, thank you very much. Exactly. So, of course, Dorothea was a good person to be around.
Okay, great. Let's move on now to the setting of the story. As usual, we have a look at the when first. Now, the action of Middlemarch takes place in 1829 and kind of wraps up by 1832. So that's about 40 years before George Eliot's time. So it qualifies, I think, as a historical novel.
Yeah, the critics actually have noted that this is, of course, a rare historical novel. So while talking about this novel, it is so successful that we rarely think of it in terms of that subgenre of fiction.
For the contemporary readers at that time, the present was about major political change that was going on. And this book would have been seen as the past that led up to that moment in time.
Yes. So, though rarely categorized as a historical novel, Middlemarch's attention to historical detail was mentioned in an 1873 review. So, people recognized that Eliot's purpose was to show that generous rural history.
Good. Okay. Let's have a question for the audience now. This is the question. Middlemarch is a historical novel. What do you think a historical novel can give us as readers?
Well, I think we try to use history to analyze the modern world.
Good answer. Yeah, I think that is the purpose of historical fiction.
Yes, of course it is. As we told you, there are main themes that are very important to focus on because these are the messages that the author is trying to give us. So one of the main themes we've chosen for you is a study of provincial life. So the fictional town of Middlemarch, North Loamshire, is based on Coventry, where actually Eliot had been living before she moved to London. So like Coventry, Middlemarch is described as a silk ribbon manufacturer town.
Now, the full title of Middlemarch, there's a bit more to it. It's not the full title. It's Middlemarch, a study of provincial life. And that gives a clue as to what her other focus is. So there are three British classes at that time, generally. The aristocratic class, the urban middle class, and then the working class. And Middlemarch focuses on the provincial, like countrymen.
Yes, and it is also worth mentioning that Eliot went to London just like Dorothea did, okay? But there is a slight difference. So when Eliot went to London, she got her fame, so she was very famous. Meanwhile, Dorothea stays a caring wife, so who is really focusing on nurturing Will and her children.
there's another similarity between the author and the character, Eliot and Dorothea. Eliot also was rejected by her family because she had settled with a man that she was not married to, and their provincial disapproval prevented her from ever going home again.
Exactly. Okay, now the second main theme, this is the question, like woman question. Central to Middlemarch is the idea that Dorothea Brooke cannot hope to achieve the stature, the heroic stature of a figure like Saint Teresa. So we can see in George Eliot's novel that the heroine of the story lives in the wrong time.
She's a woman out of time. She's not in her time. That
Maybe even more modern or something.
More modern than her time.
Exactly.
Eliot has also been criticized for ending the novel by having Dorothea marry a man, Ladislaw, who's clearly her inferior, and that was kind of criticized at that time.
Yeah, Dorothea is just like Saint Dorothea, blindly goes forward, making some mistakes, sometimes foolish, sometimes they are egotistical, but also admirably idealistic, attempt to find a role or vocation that fulfills her nature.
Very good.
Yeah.
I think it's time for a question.
Yes, Mr. Darrell, it's time for our next question. So, do you think the main themes that we have discussed together actually these main themes were influenced by the author's own life?
Yes, I think they were influenced by her life. She had an unconventional love relationship, and of course she was a woman and she would have faced the same things that happened to Dorothea.
Definitely. So we can see both like women question in George Eliot's life and of course in this novel as well.
Excellent. I'm happy with the responses.
Thank you
But I think
very
it's
much.
time to maybe wrap up our discussion now.
Yes, exactly. First of all, we talked about George Eliot. That's how she is famous in public.
And then we had a look at the summary. As you know, it's a story about an idealistic woman who gets into, maybe rubs up against the wrong way in her society.
Yes, then we talked about the characters where I would just focus on Dorothea, who is the main girl protagonist of this story.
We had a look at the setting, as you remember. It is the early part of the 19th century, and it is Middlemarch, a fictional town in England.
Yes, and of course we talked about the main themes. The first one was a study of provincial life. So you can see lots of stories from villages maybe, and the woman question.
Okay, let's review the vocabulary list one more time. Okay, we had scholar.
Metznieri, სწავლული.
We had to flatter.
Keba,
Manufacturer.
მწარმოებელი.
To embroider.
Kargwa,
Why on earth?
ratom, ristvis.
Disinherited.
მემკვიდრეობა ჩამორთმეული.
To resign.
თანამდებობიდან გადადგომა.
And bribe.
ქრთამი. Yeah, Mr. Darrell, I think now is the time for our homework.
Okay, we have a question for the TV audience so that they can participate in our discussion. Here's the question. Is the idealistic character of Dorothea a good role model for girls? Explain why or why not.
არის თუ არა დოროთეას იდეალისტური პერსონაჟი მისაბაძი დღევანდელი თანამედროვე გოგონებისთვის. ახსენით რატომ?
We would like your answers to be sent to the address on the screen.
საშინაო დავალება გამოაგზავნეთ ეკრანზე მითითებულ მისამართზე.
Okay, Ms. Marta.
I really enjoyed today's lesson, like book club, really. It was really interesting. Thank you, audience, and thank you, Mr. Darrell.
No problem. I enjoyed the book as well. It was a very interesting look at the 19th century.
Yes, exactly. So that's all for today. So we meet you next week.
Have a great week and goodbye.
Goodbye.